Kia ora, Grace City. I wonder if you've ever seen this bumper sticker anywhere as you have driven around. He who dies with the most toys wins. Now, you and I instinctively know that isn't the measurement of a successful life. That's not what life is all about, simply accumulating more toys than anywhere else. That's not why we're here, is it? That's not our purpose. But it does beg the question, what is our purpose? What is our calling here on earth? How are we meant to live? Why are we here? We're in this series, Resilient, in the New Testament letter of 1 Peter. And what we've seen in the past couple of weeks, Peter has talked about our future, our destiny, this glorious hope and future that we have if we're followers of Jesus, of a new heavens and a new earth. And because we know how the last chapter of our life ends, in this endless, beautiful place with Jesus, it really changes how we can live in this chapter today. And then last week we saw Peter dive into the question of who am I, my identity, where we look upward and I realize my identity is found in who God says I am, a child of God, a worshipper of the Almighty, an ambassador of the King. And so now Peter comes as he continues his letter and moves into almost a new section of the letter in chapter 2, verse 11. Peter now is saying, now that we are sure of where we're going, our future and our destiny, and we're secure in our identity and who we are as a child of God in Jesus, now it's time to think about, why am I here? What's my calling? How am I meant to live at this point in my life today? And that's what he's going to answer here in this next section. He primarily answers the question, why am I here? What is my calling? In just two verses, verses 11 and 12 of 1 Peter 2. And then he takes the next three paragraphs that we're going to look at today to almost tease that out. What does that look like in different areas of life? So let's look first, though, at how he answers the question, why am I here? Here's what Peter says in verses 11 and 12 of 1 Peter 2. Dear friends, he writes, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Did you notice the way that Peter speaks to them or identifies his readers here? He calls them dear friends, which is a beautiful expression of love, but then he also describes them in the next line as foreigners and exiles. He'd already called them exiles in his greeting in chapter 1, verse 1. Now he adds this idea of foreigners, and he's identifying the fact that for many of the people he's writing to, they've been marginalized and ostracized in their communities and societies because of their faith in Jesus. They've been pushed to the side. And I think increasingly, particularly in Western cultures, that's how many Christians feel about our place as well. And of course, in the majority world, that's where Christians have been for centuries as well. Here's how one pastor, a Hispanic pastor by the name of Juan Sanchez, describes it. He says, in our own day, it's becoming increasingly difficult to live as a Christian. It feels more and more that we are exiles in a world we once called our own. Our culture, he writes, seems to misunderstand us more and more and to malign and mock us more and more. So Peter here is writing to followers of Jesus who feel marginalized, feel like they're foreigners and exiles in their own community and society, their own backyard. So how are we to live when we feel like that? Well, a number of years ago, I came across a really insightful idea that we basically have four options. And I can't remember who wrote this, so I can't give credit, unfortunately. But we have four options in how we live in this world when we feel like foreigners and exiles. One is that we just fit in. We just become like the world around us. We drop our standards, we just adopt the lifestyle of everyone else, and we just fit in with everyone. We just fit in with the world. But that's not what we're called to do, which is why in verse 11, Peter says, no, you abstain from sinful desires. Don't be like everyone else. The second option is we don't fit in, we fight back. We feel like our society's changing, maybe our world is kind of going down the gurgler, and so we want to fight back, we want to reclaim our culture, we want to get involved in some culture wars, and so the church needs to fight. But we forget that Paul, writing to the Ephesians, said we don't fight flesh and blood. We're not here to battle with people. We're here to pray against principalities and powers. And we're to wage war against our own sinful desires. That's what Peter said. Abstain from sinful desires that wage war against your soul. So for Peter, the way we live out our calling is not to just fit in with the world around us, and it's not to fight back with the world around us. But then thirdly, it's not to opt out either, which is another option. Just opt out. Let's withdraw from the world. And sometimes in church history, that is what some followers of Jesus have done. Let's retreat into a bubble, a monastery, a commune. Let's get away from that evil world around us and just kind of huddle together. But again, that's not what Peter wants us to do either. That's why in verse 12 he writes, live such good lives among the pagans. Peter expects us to stay in a culture that's marginalizing us, that's treating us like foreigners and exiles, and live our life in the world, but not being of the world. So for Peter, we're not to just fit in and become like the world. We're not to fight back against the world, and we're not to opt out away from the world. So what are we to do? Well, for Peter, it's option 4, stand out. Don't fit in or fight back or opt out. Stand out. Make a difference. Be different to others in the world through the way that you follow Jesus. And that's exactly what he's calling for at this part of the letter. This is our calling, Peter says. Let me read verse 12 again. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Notice that phrase in the middle of that, though they accuse you of doing wrong. I love the way that pastor and author Chuck Swindoll speaks to that when he writes the most convincing defense against that kind of slander, he says, is the silent integrity of our character. The silent integrity of our character. And so what Peter's calling for here, what Peter's trying to help us see is, why am I here? I'm not here to just fit in and be like the world around me. I'm not here to fight back for my culture. I'm not here to opt out and withdraw. I'm here to live among sinful people, pagans he calls them. And I'm here to stand out in the way that I live for Jesus and point people to him. So why am I here according to Peter? Well, I'm here secure in my identity in Jesus, knowing that my future is secure. I am here then to stand out and make a difference and point people to Jesus. Here's the key idea I want us to grasp today. This is how Peter answers the question. I am here to be a signpost of grace, pointing people to Jesus. I'm here to be a signpost of grace, pointing people to Jesus. So the best way I can imagine this is with this. This is me, and this is you if we're followers of Jesus. We're meant to be signposts in the way that we live our lives and the words we use and the way we interact with people. We're to be signposts of grace that are pointing people towards Jesus. Hey, check Jesus out. I'm different, and it's because of him. And what Peter's calling us to do in this letter is to not just fit in with the culture and be like them. It's not to fight back and beat them over the head. It's not to opt out and withdraw. It's to live among lost people and stand out by the difference of our character and the difference Jesus has made as signposts of grace. This is me. This is you. Let's point people to Jesus. That's what Peter's calling for. So how do we do that? How do we point people to Jesus? What does that look like? So what Peter does then in the next 3 paragraphs, all the way through to the beginning of chapter 3, is he's going to tease this out in 3 different areas of life. He's going to talk about the way we operate in the world as citizens of our government. He's going to talk about the way we operate in our workplace as employees. And he's going to talk about our home life, particularly marriage, but I want to extend it beyond marriage as well. And it's not that these are the only areas where to do that. Peter's taking these three key areas of life to say, this is what it looks like to be a signpost of grace. This is how you point people to Jesus. And it's not just these areas, it's every area of life where to do this in. So what does that look like? Well, what unites these three paragraphs that we're going to see in verses 13 to 17, and then 18 to 25, and then in chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, each of them begin with the same command. It's the word submit. Now, we don't like that word in our modern world. The idea of submitting feels very powerless. And we're in a culture where we're about standing up for our rights and not being abused and not being taken for granted. And so this biblical teaching, this is very countercultural. But let me see if I can just help us understand this word submit for a minute. The word in the original Greek language actually literally means to place yourself under. So it's the idea of voluntarily putting yourself down, taking the low position. It's really a call to servanthood and to humility and to service. And there's three key things we need to understand if we're to understand the biblical command to submit. Number one, it's voluntary. No one in the Bible is ever commanded to make someone else submit to them. That is utterly unbiblical. It is always a call for you, if you're a follower of Jesus, to voluntarily submit yourself. So it's not a coercion thing, it's a voluntary call to servanthood. Secondly, I think it's primarily about an attitude. You see, Peter is writing here to wives in chapter 3, in a patriarchal society where they had no power in their marriage. He's writing to slaves in chapter 2 who were considered property of their masters. He's writing to citizens of the Roman Empire also in chapter 2, where the Roman Emperor was a tyrant who had all the power. And so in these situations, submit's not simply a call to do the right thing and obey or whatever, because that's a given. It's not so much about what you do, it's how you do it. So I think the call to submit is primarily a call to an attitude of our heart. To say, I'm going to voluntarily lower myself, see myself as the servant, and in whatever situation I find myself, I am going to put myself low like Jesus and humble myself and serve others. So it's voluntary, it's an attitude. The third thing I want us to see here is it's all of us. Doesn't matter who you are. If you're a follower of Jesus, every one of us are called to be submissive, to take this posture, this heart attitude of lowering ourselves, of being humble to serve. And that's what Peter's going to talk about in each of these three spheres. So the first sphere is in the world as citizens. And so Peter's going to call us to be signposts of grace, to point people to Jesus in the way that we operate as citizens. Here's what he says, chapter 2, verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. So the first submission call, the voluntary attitude of being a humble servant, is towards government, particularly the emperor and his governors. Now, in Peter's day, this was remarkable because the emperor held all the power with his leadership and governing authorities. And when Peter wrote this letter, the emperor at this moment was actually the infamous Nero. Nero would go on a few years after this letter was written to lead the persecution of Christians. He was the one who pioneered the idea of throwing Christians alive to the lions. He would crucify our brothers and sisters in his garden in Rome and then set the people on fire as human torches when dusk fell. He was horrendous. And yet Peter here is calling for followers of Jesus at this time and today to have an attitude of submission towards the emperor and towards the governors and human government in general. What does that look like? How does that really flesh out? Well, it actually looks like respect and honor. That's where Peter ends up at the end of this paragraph, verse 17. Show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, and honor the emperor. That's his summary to end it all. And the word honor at the end and the word respect at the beginning of that verse, they're the same word. So for Peter, he's saying, no matter what the emperor does, and you don't need to agree with everything he does, but we need to respect and honor. We need to voluntarily take the attitude of submission and lower ourselves. So what does that look like for you and I today? Well, we don't serve an emperor, but we do have a government and we have a prime minister. And so let me say it straight out. Whether you admire Jacinda Ardern and think she's awesome, whether you think she's absolutely horrendous, doesn't matter. Peter's call here is for you and I to submit to the government that we have in our country. And that means we give proper respect and honor and dignity, and we have an attitude of humility and graciousness towards those in government. Now, I can already see the hackles coming up on the necks of some people. Hold on, does that mean we always have to agree, that we can't disagree, that we can't protest? Does that mean there's never a place for civil disobedience? What if the government passes laws that are completely unbiblical? Can we disobey those? And the answer to all of those questions is yeah. We have a right to disagree. We can protest. We can make submissions against legislation we think is wrong. And there are times, if government calls us to do things that are unbiblical, then our response, as it was in the book of Acts, is to say we have to obey God rather than men. So all of that's a given. But in the midst of all of that, the Bible calls us to this attitude of submission, to voluntarily place ourselves under, which in this case means with an attitude of respect and an attitude of honor. Now, we live in a democracy. And not only do we have the right to engage, to vote, to speak, to contribute, to offer our opinion, to make submissions, to stand for an office if we feel called by God to do that. That's our responsibility. We should do that. But we need to make sure how we do it points people to Jesus, because this is our calling. This is why we're here. And you know what? As I look back over these last few years of this global pandemic, as I look ahead to the next few years of real economic turmoil and, cost of living crises and fuel prices going up, everything else we're facing, we live in an incredibly divisive time, don't we? Where there's incredible disunity in our society. There's partisanship, there's disagreement, there's vitriol, there's anger being expressed. I can't believe what people say on social media. The call to you and me, if we're followers of Jesus, is not to opt out and not contribute to the discussion and not be part of a democracy. But it's not to fit in and be like everyone else. And it's not to fight back and really give it to the people we disagree with, including the government if we don't like them. No. We're to stand out. We're to stand out because of our humility. We're to stand out because of our respect. We're to stand out in the way that we speak with kindness and compassion, whether it's in a conversation at the water cooler at work, whether it's in a post on Facebook or Instagram or some other social media. We are to be signposts of grace as we operate as citizens in this world, because this is why we're here. This is what you and I are. We're signposts of grace pointing people to Jesus. And Peter says we need to do that in our world as respectful citizens. We point people to Jesus in the world as respectful citizens. The second sphere or area then is in the area of employment. Here's what he goes on to write in verses 18 and 19. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Because it's commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they're conscious of God. And then Peter goes on and points to the example of Jesus as the ultimate example of one who does that. Now, when we read about slavery, we need to be a little careful here, because for us, the images that come into most of our minds is the images of the American South over the last few hundred years. And that was horrendous. And while slavery was still bad in the Roman Empire, it wasn't like that. Number one, it wasn't based on race. It was based on economics. Most people ended up as slaves because they were in debt or in poverty and couldn't get out of that. The other thing we have to understand about slavery in the Roman Empire is that by and large, slaves could buy their freedom. And in fact, the early church were pioneers in encouraging slaves to buy their freedom and actually giving out huge amounts of money over the centuries and decades to buy the freedom of many slaves and set them free in the name of Jesus. And the other thing we need to understand too is when we think of slaves in the Roman Empire, we think of someone, scrubbing the floor or doing some menial task. And that was what some slaves did. But many slaves in the Roman Empire, which was about a third, even a half of all of the people in the Roman Empire, they were incredibly skilled. Let me read a list of some of the occupations that slaves had at this time. Doctors, nurses, teachers, writers, editors, accountants, lawyers, salespeople, overseers or managers, secretaries, sea captains. Don't think sea captains quite works for most of us, but most of those other occupations, that's what many of us, most of us maybe do in our lives. You see, they were almost the equivalent of what many of us do in our workplace. Now, we're not slaves today, although slavery does exist in New Zealand and pockets, but very much still around the world. And we really, I believe, should support ministries and organisations that are working to end modern day slavery. But here's what we need to understand. Peter is writing to these people about the way they operate in their workplace. Now, if they were a slave, it still wasn't a great thing. They were still considered property. They could be treated incredibly harshly, which Peter acknowledges. They could be abused, beaten, all kinds of things. Which is why early Christians tried to buy the slavery of many slaves to set them free. Yet in the midst of that, what does Peter call for them to do? Submit. Slaves, submit to your masters, no matter what they're like. Now they had to obey anyway, so it's not so much a call to action, but again this call to attitude. Would you voluntarily lower yourself, humble yourself, take the low place? Now, slaves were already in the low place, but Peter is calling them to choose an attitude of servanthood and humility to point people to Jesus. See, we point people to Jesus in the workplace as model employees. So how does that come over to you and me today? Well, just think about the way that you do your work, whatever that looks like, whatever work that you do in your life. How does the way that you work point people to Jesus? How does your attitude in whatever your workplace is serve as a signpost of grace? Do you adopt this attitude each day as you walk into the classroom or the building site or the office or wherever it is that you work? Do you go in humbly placing yourself under, taking the low place, being willing to take on some of the tasks that no one else wants? See, there's this incredible attitude change that Peter is calling for from us as followers of Jesus. Hey, voluntarily lower yourself. Take the humble position. Take the low place. Why? Because you and me are signposts of grace. We are here simply to point people to Jesus. And we can do that in the way we operate in the world around us, and we can do that in the way we operate in the workplace. And then the third area, the third sphere of life that Peter calls this from us is in the home. And specifically here, he's going to speak to the marriage relationship. Here's what he writes in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, which really should be still part of the previous chapter. Chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Now, these verses have been misunderstood copiously. They've been taught in ways that I don't think are right. There's a lot of wrong thinking that goes around them. And let's be honest, these verses and verses like them elsewhere in Scripture have been used to actually encourage and feed abuse and misogyny, and that's wrong. What we need to understand is this is simply the third sphere of life, the third area where Peter's simply calling for this attitude of lowering ourselves as followers of Jesus, to point people to Jesus. So he's already talked about it in the world and in the workplace, and now he's talking about it in marriage. Wives, do the same thing. Lower yourself and serve your husbands. Take the low position. Now immediately, of course, I can hear all of the questions. Wait a minute, what about the husbands? Well, actually, Peter calls for exactly the same attitude from the husbands. He spends quite a chunk of time, 6 verses, talking to wives, because the majority of the followers of Jesus in the early church were actually women. So he speaks to them specifically first. But then he writes this in verse 7 of chapter 3. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Think about them and their needs, he says. Goes on, treat them with respect as the weaker partner, which is not a slur on women. It's simply the acknowledgement that by and large there's a physical strength difference between men and women, but also treat them with respect as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life. So Peter's just pointed to the equality between husbands and wives, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Now, did you notice the phrase that he started this verse with the husbands? Husbands, in the same way, be considerate. In the same way is pointing back to the rest of this section, which is all about submission. He's calling for husbands to submit to wives as wives submit to husbands. Now, this was a patriarchal world where the husband had all the power. The wives were just treated like property or chattel. But can you imagine the power of this in Peter's time? What he's calling for is marriage relationships where both husband and wife were followers of Jesus, where the wife was voluntarily, not coerced, voluntarily taking on an attitude of a servant, lowering herself, looking to meet the needs of her husband. And at the same time, the husband is voluntarily, not coercion, voluntarily lowering himself, thinking about his wife, taking the place of humility, meeting her needs. And it almost becomes this competition. Who can lower ourselves more and be the greatest servant in our home? And in the patriarchal world that Peter was writing to, this was revolutionary. And it still is today. Because when we can have marriages and homes where we are choosing submission and servanthood and humility and the needs of others over our own selfishness, that doesn't happen in this world. And do you know what we're doing? We're living out our calling. We're being signposts of grace. And we're pointing people to Jesus. And this is the call of Peter, folks. What Peter is saying is, if we're secure in our identity in Jesus and we know where we're going to this beautiful future hope he has in store for us, we can live like this. We have the security to live lives that are different. Because we're here. This is our calling. We're here to be signposts of grace, pointing people to Jesus. This is why God has left us in this place. So Peter's call to us, don't just fit in and be like everyone else. Don't just opt out and withdraw from lost people around you. Don't fight back and try and take this culture back. No, stand out. Be different. As you operate in the issue of politics, in the world around us, in your workplace, in your home, and every other sphere, be a signpost of grace. Lower yourself, be a person of humility and service, and point people to Jesus. As we finish, then I want to ask you 2 simple questions. Number 1, is there an area of your life where you look at and you realize, you know what, I'm not doing a great job of this. I'm not pointing people to Jesus. I'm not lowering myself as much as I could. Can I just invite you to take that and bring that to God for a moment? But then equally, and we don't do this side as much as preachers, but is there an area of life where you are doing this well? Whereas you look back on the last few days, you think, man, I'm an imperfect signpost. I'm a bit bent and broken, but I pointed people to Jesus. Celebrate that and thank him for that. Because this is our calling, folks. This is who we are. We're here to be signposts of grace. pointing people to Jesus. God bless you.